The room is quiet, but your hand isn't. Your thumb moves before you even think. Screen lights up. Another automatic swipe. You don't even remember what you came here for. You just needed to break the silence. Your body doesn't tolerate empty space. Your mind starts searching for stimulation, like it's oxygen. This isn't curiosity, it's avoidance. Because when nothing is happening out there, something starts happening in here. And that's uncomfortable. That tiny motion, scrolling, feels harmless. But pay attention to the urgency. If this were freedom, there wouldn't be tension in the pause. So here's the deal. Stay. Or scroll right now. You don't know how to be alone with your own mind anymore. Not really. The moment the room goes quiet, your hand reaches for something. Your phone, a tab, a notification, anything. There's a reflex in you now. A twitch. A few seconds of silence and something inside starts to itch. You call it boredom. You call it normal. You call it just checking. But notice this! You don't check because something happened. You check because nothing happened, and that nothing feels unbearable. Aldous Huxley once warned that the most efficient form of control would not come through pain, but through pleasure. That people would learn to love the very things that weakened them. He wasn't talking about whips. He was talking about distractions. You don't need chains when the cage feels entertaining. Look at your day. You wake up and before your feet touch the floor, your brain is already fed. Scroll, message, headline, short video, another one. You don't even remember deciding. You just move. There are gaps in your day, tiny openings where you could feel something real, waiting in line, sitting in your car before going inside, a pause between tasks, and every single time you fill the gap. Not because you're busy, but because you're avoiding. Avoiding what? That strange, hollow sensation when there's no stimulus. That low-level discomfort when there's nothing to react to. That quiet confrontation with your own thoughts. You tell yourself you're free. Free to watch. Free to scroll. Free to click. Free to consume. But answer this honestly. If you tried to stop for 1 full hour, no phone, no music, no background noise, no entertainment, could you? Or would your body feel restless? Would your chest tighten? Would your mind start bargaining? Just 5 minutes. Just one quick check. I deserve a break. You don't notice it because it's subtle. There's no dramatic collapse, no visible addiction, just a gradual erosion of your tolerance for silence. You used to be harder to manipulate. You could sit with boredom. You could endure discomfort long enough to finish something difficult. Now, a difficult task feels heavier than it used to. A slow process feels intolerable. Deep focus feels almost painful. And so you trade it. You trade effort for stimulation. You trade silence for noise. You trade strength for comfort. Not in one big decision, in 1,000 small ones. The problem is not pleasure itself. The problem is that you've started using pleasure as anesthesia. And anesthesia always has a cost. You just haven't felt the full bill yet. Here's the part no one wants to admit. You are not weak because you seek pleasure. You're weak because you can't tolerate discomfort without sedating it. There's a difference. Pleasure used to be a reward. Now it's a reflex. The second, something feels hard, uncertain, boring, slow. You reach for relief. A notification, a snack, a video, a hit of validation. It's subtle, almost invisible. You don't collapse into addiction overnight. You slowly rewire your nervous system to expect constant stimulation. And once your brain adapts to that level of input, normal life starts to feel dull. Reading a book feels slow. Working on something meaningful feels exhausting. Having one difficult conversation feels overwhelming. Not because you're incapable, but because your threshold for discomfort has shrunk. You trained it to. You've been feeding yourself microdoses of pleasure all day long. Tiny bursts of dopamine, quick spikes, fast rewards. And every spike teaches your brain one thing. Relief is always available. You never have to sit in this. So you don't. You don't sit in confusion long enough to think deeply. You don't sit in frustration long enough to grow resilience. You don't sit in loneliness long enough to understand what you actually need. You escape over and over, and you call that freedom. But here's the risk you don't want to hear. If you cannot stay with discomfort, you cannot build strength. Strength is built in the exact space you keep running from, the 5 extra minutes of effort, the silent evening without distraction, the unfinished task you want to abandon. That space is where mental endurance is formed, but you've replaced endurance with access. Access to entertainment, access to distraction, access to instant relief. And the more relief you consume, the less friction you can tolerate. Notice how fast your mood shifts when your internet is slow. Notice how irritated you get when a video buffers. Notice how quickly you abandon something that doesn't reward you immediately. This isn't random. Your nervous system is being trained. Every time you choose stimulation over stillness, you reinforce the idea that discomfort is dangerous. It's not. It's information. But you never stay long enough to decode it. Instead, you numb it. You don't scream. You don't rebel. You don't even realize it. You just stay busy. Busy enough to avoid the hollow feeling underneath. And here's the sentence you probably won't like. You are not overwhelmed. You are undertrained. Undertrained in boredom. Undertrained in silence. Undertrained in staying. The pursuit of pleasure hasn't destroyed you dramatically. It has weakened you quietly. And quiet weakness is the most efficient kind. Because you defend it, you protect it, you justify it. After all, what's wrong with a little entertainment? What's wrong with enjoying life? Nothing. Until enjoyment becomes your only coping strategy. Until pleasure becomes your escape hatch from every form of pressure. Until you can't tell the difference between rest and avoidance. And right now, you're closer to avoidance than you think. There was a time when control was obvious. It came through force, through fear, through punishment. You obeyed because you were afraid of pain. That model is outdated. Aldous Huxley saw something far more efficient coming. A society where people wouldn't need to be forced into submission. They would volunteer for it, not because they were threatened, because they were entertained. In Brave New World, control didn't look like oppression. It looked like pleasure. Endless stimulation, constant gratification, a steady drip of comfort that kept people docile. No rebellion, no deep questioning, no inner friction strong enough to wake them up. Because friction had been removed, and friction is what builds resistance. Think about that. When your day is filled with fast pleasure, your tolerance for resistance disappears. And once resistance disappears, so does depth. You don't read long enough to wrestle with ideas. You don't sit with complexity long enough to change your mind. You don't stay in discomfort long enough to transform. You skim, you scroll, you sample, but you don't endure. That's not laziness, that's conditioning. Modern control doesn't look like someone telling you what to think. It looks like you being too distracted to think at all. You are offered endless content, so you never have to confront contentment. You are fed stimulation, so you never have to face stillness. And the most dangerous part? You defend it. If someone suggests you unplug, you call them extreme. If someone questions constant entertainment, you call them rigid. If someone chooses silence, you call them boring. Because the system doesn't need guards, it needs your participation. And you participate every time you choose comfort over clarity. This is what modern slavery looks like. No chains, no visible master, just impulses. You wake up and immediately check your phone. You don't ask why. You just do. That's not a decision. That's a loop. A loop reinforced by algorithms designed to keep you engaged, not evil. Efficient. Because attention is power. And the more fragmented your attention becomes, the less power you retain. Huxley feared a world where truth would be drowned in irrelevance. Not burned, drowned, buried under so much noise that no one would care enough to look. Look at your own mind. How long can you hold one thought before reaching for something else? How long can you stay with one uncomfortable idea without diluting it with distraction? When pleasure becomes constant, depth becomes optional. And when depth becomes optional, strength becomes rare. You don't need to be silenced if you are overstimulated. You don't need to be oppressed if you are pacified. And right now, you are more pacified than you realize. Not because someone forced you. Because it feels good. That's the brilliance of it. And that's the trap. You don't notice the cost at first. That's what makes it dangerous. Nothing dramatic happens. You still function. You still work. You still show up. but something inside you is thinning. Your tolerance for boredom shrinks. Your ability to concentrate fractures. Your emotional endurance weakens. You start multiple things. You finish fewer. You tell yourself you're just tired. But it's not exhaustion. It's fragmentation. Your attention is constantly split between what you're doing and what you could be consuming instead. While you're working, part of you is craving stimulation. While you're resting, part of you is scanning for something better. Your mind rarely lands. It hovers. And a hovering mind cannot go deep. Depth requires sustained discomfort. Reading past the first wave of boredom. Practicing after the initial frustration. Staying in the conversation after it becomes tense. But the second it feels heavy, you escape. Not consciously, automatically, and every time you escape, you teach yourself something subtle. This is too much for me. So your world shrinks to match your tolerance. You choose easier tasks, shorter formats, faster rewards. You say you want growth, but you design your environment around ease. There's another cost you don't see. When you finally try to stop, when you say, "I'm going to unplug tonight," something strange happens. The silence feels loud. Your thoughts get sharper, old worries surface, unfinished emotions rise. And suddenly, you don't feel calm, you feel restless, almost anxious. So you reach back for the anesthetic. Not because you're weak, because you've trained yourself to avoid raw contact with your own mind. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The moment you try to change, your environment reacts. You stop responding instantly to messages, and people ask if something's wrong. You say no to one more show, and someone calls you intense. You put your phone down at dinner, and it feels socially awkward. The system prefers you distracted, not in a conspiracy sense, in a behavioral one. When everyone is stimulated, stillness looks suspicious. When everyone is reactive, calm looks distant. When everyone is constantly available, boundaries look cold. So you feel pressure to return to the pattern, to soften your discipline, to relax your focus, to join back in, because being centered in a restless world creates friction, and friction makes you visible. But this is the hidden erosion. You lose the ability to hold tension, and without tension, there is no strength. Muscles grow under resistance, character grows under restraint, attention grows under boredom. You've removed the resistance from your life, and now you wonder why you feel mentally soft. No one attacked you. No one broke you. You surrendered in increments. One scroll at a time. One avoided silence at a time. One small relief after another, until comfort became your default setting and strength became optional. Here is the turning point. You keep telling yourself that you're choosing this, that you're free. Free to watch what you want, free to scroll when you want, free to stop whenever you decide. But answer this without performing for yourself. If you're so free, why does stopping feel like deprivation? Aldous Huxley suggested that the real danger was not that we would be controlled by pain, but that we would be reduced to passivity by pleasure. Read that again. Reduced, not attacked, not imprisoned. Reduced. This is the part that cuts. You call it freedom. But you can't stop. You call it relaxation. But you feel restless without it. You call it harmless. But your focus is weaker, your discipline thinner, your silence shorter. Here's the sentence you've been avoiding. You call it freedom what you cannot quit, and that should disturb you. Because freedom is not the ability to indulge. Freedom is the ability to abstain. If you cannot put your phone down for a full evening without agitation, that's not neutrality, that's dependence. If you cannot finish a hard task without needing micro rewards every 15 minutes, that's not modern life. That's conditioning. And conditioning always benefits something. The platform, the algorithm, the economy of attention, but rarely you. This is not about demonizing pleasure. It's about recognizing when pleasure has become your regulator. When you feel stressed, you stimulate. When you feel bored, you stimulate. When you feel lonely, you stimulate. When you feel uncertain, you stimulate. You don't process, you don't endure, you override, and every override makes you slightly less capable of standing inside discomfort without collapsing. Here's what's brutal. The system doesn't need you addicted. It just needs you distracted enough to never build real internal power. Real power requires sustained attention. Real power requires the ability to sit still long enough to confront your own contradictions. Real power requires silence, and you are systematically avoiding all three. If this is uncomfortable to hear, good. It means you haven't numbed out completely. If this tension is hitting something in you, don't scroll away from it. Stay. If you're going to stay here with me, subscribe. Not because this channel will entertain you, but because it will keep cutting through the noise you've grown comfortable with. You don't need more content, you need friction, and friction is what we're building here. Now the real question is this: what happens when you actually remove the anesthetic? When you stop feeding yourself instant relief? That's where things get interesting. And that's where most people run. When you remove the anesthetic, the first thing you feel is not clarity. It's withdrawal. You sit down in silence, and your body doesn't relax. It vibrates. Your thoughts speed up instead of slowing down. Old memories surface without invitation. Half-finished worries crawl back into view. You thought distraction was helping you cope. It was postponing contact. Now, you're in direct contact. And direct contact feels raw. You notice how loud your internal dialogue actually is, how quickly it jumps from regret to fantasy to fear, how uncomfortable it is to simply sit without reaching for something. This is the moment most people interpret incorrectly. They think, silence makes me anxious. No, silence reveals the anxiety that stimulation was covering. You were never calm. You were distracted. And there's a difference. When you stop numbing yourself with constant input, you start to see the unfinished parts of your life, the conversations you've avoided, the work you've postponed, the decisions you've delayed. Pleasure kept you busy enough to not feel the weight of those things. Now the weight is here, and it feels heavier than it should, because you've been avoiding lifting it. Here's what else happens. Your environment doesn't necessarily applaud your discipline. You stop replying instantly, and people label you distant. You decline one more night of passive entertainment, and someone calls you intense. You sit quietly in a room full of noise, and you look out of place. You start noticing how addicted everyone else is. And that realization isolates you. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You watch friends reach for their phones mid-conversation. You see how silence makes people uncomfortable. You notice how quickly tension gets neutralized with humor, scrolling, or snacks. And if you choose not to participate, you disrupt the rhythm. Disruption creates subtle social friction, and friction tempts you to return, to soften, to join back in, to be normal. This is the invisible contract. Stay distracted, stay agreeable, stay stimulated, and in return, you get comfort. But the cost of breaking that contract is growth. Growth feels lonely at first, because you are no longer synced with the pace of constant stimulation. You begin to realize something unsettling. You weren't choosing pleasure. You were avoiding exposure to yourself. And without distraction, you are exposed. Exposed to your impulses. Exposed to your impatience. Exposed to your lack of endurance. That exposure is not weakness. It's information. But it only becomes strength if you stay. If you sit long enough for the agitation to pass. If you resist the urge to reach. If you let the nervous system recalibrate. Because on the other side of withdrawal is something most people never experience anymore. Stillness that doesn't feel empty. Focus that doesn't feel forced. Presence that doesn't need enhancement. But you don't get there by sampling silence. You get there by enduring it. And endurance is exactly what your comfort addiction has been eroding. The question is not whether you can handle silence. The question is whether you are willing to go through the discomfort required to earn it. Most people aren't. And that's why they stay distracted, not trapped. Distracted. There's a difference. And one of those is harder to escape. Here's the part no one advertises. When you stop chasing constant pleasure, you don't become instantly enlightened. You become different. And different is expensive. You start choosing depth over stimulation. You read longer. You think slower. You pause before reacting. You don't fill every silence. At first, it feels unnatural, almost wrong, because your identity was built around responsiveness, around being available, around being entertained. Now you're building something else, endurance. And endurance changes you. You begin to notice how much of your personality was shaped by reaction, how many of your opinions were half-formed because you never sat with them long enough, how much of your relaxation was just avoidance in disguise. This is where the shift becomes existential. It's no longer about screen time. It's about who you are when there is nothing to consume. Who are you when there is no noise? Who are you when there is no instant reward? Who are you when there is no audience? Most people never find out, because they never remove the constant input long enough to meet themselves without enhancement. But when you do, something uncomfortable happens. You realize how much of your sense of self depended on stimulation. Without it, you feel exposed, not empty, unfiltered. And that exposure is a rite of passage. You are trading one identity for another, from someone who reacts to someone who chooses, from someone who escapes to someone who stays, from someone who needs pleasure to someone who can endure silence. That trade costs you comfort. It may cost you social ease, it may cost you the illusion of effortlessness. But what you gain is internal solidity. And solidity cannot be manipulated easily. A distracted mind is easy to steer, a restless mind is easy to hook. But a disciplined mind? Harder to influence, harder to provoke, harder to sell to. That's why this matters. Not because pleasure is evil, but because dependence is profitable. For someone. If this tension has been sitting with you throughout this video, don't ignore it. Stay with it, because this is not about productivity hacks or digital detox trends. It's about whether you are living from compulsion or choice. And if this conversation is hitting something deeper, there's a reason. There's a book called O Acordo Esquecido by Luciana Santos. It doesn't promise comfort. It examines the silent agreements you make with yourself without noticing, the ones that shape your behavior long before you realize you signed them. If you're curious, you'll find it in the pinned comment, not as a solution, as a mirror. Because at some point, this stops being about screens. It becomes about identity. You don't rebuild strength by eliminating pleasure. You rebuild strength by restoring your capacity to abstain, to sit, to endure, to stay present when nothing is entertaining you. This is not self-improvement. It's self-confrontation. And self-confrontation changes your place in the world. You move differently, you respond differently, you consume differently. And that shift is not cosmetic, it's structural. So here is the question that remains. If you removed every easy distraction from your life for 30 days, who would be left? Not who you perform as, not who you scroll as, who you actually are when there is no constant relief. Would you meet someone solid or someone restless and unfinished? Be honest, and then tell me in the comments. What's the one pleasure you suspect you're using to avoid yourself, not to judge it, to face it? Because the moment you can stop and choose not to, is the moment you find out whether you were free or just comfortably addicted. Here's the part no one advertises. When you stop chasing constant pleasure, you don't become instantly enlightened. You become different, and different is expensive. You start choosing depth over stimulation. You read longer, you think slower, you pause before reacting, you don't fill every silence. At first it feels unnatural, almost wrong, because your identity was built around responsiveness, around being available, around being entertained. Now you're building something else, endurance, and endurance changes you. You begin to notice how much of your personality was shaped by reaction, how many of your opinions were half-formed because you never sat with them long enough, how much of your relaxation was just avoidance in disguise. This is where the shift becomes existential. It's no longer about screen time, it's about who you are when there is nothing to consume. Who are you when there is no noise? Who are you when there is no instant reward? Who are you when there is no audience? Most people never find out, because they never remove the constant input long enough to meet themselves without enhancement. But when you do, something uncomfortable happens. You realize how much of your sense of self depended on stimulation. Without it, you feel exposed, not empty, unfiltered. And that exposure is a rite of passage. You are trading one identity for another, from someone who reacts to someone who chooses, from someone who escapes to someone who stays, from someone who needs pleasure to someone who can endure silence. That trade costs you comfort. It may cost you social ease. It may cost you the illusion of effortlessness. But what you gain is internal solidity. And solidity cannot be manipulated easily. A distracted mind is easy to steer. A restless mind is easy to hook. But a disciplined mind? Harder to influence, harder to provoke, harder to sell to. That's why this matters. Not because pleasure is evil, but because dependence is profitable. For someone. If this tension has been sitting with you throughout this video, don't ignore it. Stay with it, because this is not about productivity hacks or digital detox trends. It's about whether you are living from compulsion or choice. And if this conversation is hitting something deeper, there's a reason. There's a book called O Acordo Esquecido by Luciana Santos. It doesn't promise comfort. It examines the silent agreements you make with yourself without noticing, the ones that shape your behavior long before you realize you signed them. If you're curious, you'll find it in the pinned comment, not as a solution, as a mirror. Because at some point, this stops being about screens. It becomes about identity. You don't rebuild strength by eliminating pleasure. You rebuild strength by restoring your capacity to abstain, to sit, to endure, to stay present when nothing is entertaining you. This is not self-improvement. It's self-confrontation. And self-confrontation changes your place in the world. You move differently, you respond differently, you consume differently. And that shift is not cosmetic, it's structural. So here is the question that remains. If you removed every easy distraction from your life for 30 days, who would be left? Not who you perform as, not who you scroll as, who you actually are when there is no constant relief. Would you meet someone solid or someone restless and unfinished? Be honest, and then tell me in the comments. What's the one pleasure you suspect you're using to avoid yourself, not to judge it, to face it? Because the moment you can stop and choose not to, is the moment you find out whether you were free or just comfortably addicted.